My parents sold my inheritance to fund my golden child brother's lifestyle. When I discovered my parents had sold my inheritance to fund my brother's fifth failed business, I realized family loyalty has its limits. My name is Courtney, and I'm 28 years old. This is the story of how my own parents betrayed me in the most devastating way imaginable, all to enable my brother's reckless lifestyle. It's a tale of family, greed, and ultimately survival. When I discovered my parents had sold my inheritance to fund my brother's fifth failed business, I realized family loyalty has its limits. Grandma Eleanor was the anchor of our family. She was this remarkable woman who had raised 3 children on her own after my grandfather died young. She worked 2 jobs most of her life, saved every penny she could, and still managed to be the most generous person I've ever known. Her small but well-kept house on Maple Street was more than just a building. It was where our family memories were made. I was always closer to Grandma than anyone else in our family. Perhaps it was because I saw in her a strength I admired, or maybe it was simply that she took time to listen when no one else did. While my parents doted on my brother Michael, treating him like some sort of prince destined for greatness, Grandma saw me. She saw my potential, my dreams, and my struggles. Michael, 2 years younger than me, had always been the golden child. Whatever he wanted, he got. If he broke something, I was blamed. If he needed money for some new scheme, our parents found it somewhere. His education was fully funded despite his mediocre grades, while I worked 2 jobs to put myself through community college. The pattern was clear. Michael was the investment, and I was the afterthought. Grandma noticed this imbalance.
During our weekly tea sessions in her cozy kitchen, she would listen to my frustrations and offer wisdom without criticizing my parents directly. She believed in fairness and in recognizing each person's worth. It was during one of these sessions, about a year before she passed, that she first mentioned her plans for her estate. She had a will, she explained, that had been carefully crafted with the help of a lawyer. The house, her most valuable asset, would go to me. Not because she loved me more, she emphasized, but because she knew I would cherish it and care for it as she had. The rest of her savings would be divided among her 3 children, my father, my aunt, and my uncle. I was touched, but didn't think much of it at the time. Grandma was healthy and vibrant at 72, still tending her garden and walking to the farmer's market every Saturday. The inheritance seemed a distant reality, something to think about decades in the future. That future came much sooner than any of us expected. One crisp October morning, I received the call that Grandma had suffered a massive heart attack in her sleep. She was gone. The grief was overwhelming, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. My family gathered at the house on Maple Street, the place that had held so many happy memories, now feeling empty without her presence. The funeral was a blur of black clothes, sympathetic hugs, and casseroles from neighbors. My parents seemed genuinely devastated, though I noticed their grief was mixed with practical concerns about the estate. Michael, typically self-absorbed, made a show of being the grieving grandson, though he kept asking about when the will would be read. 2 weeks after the funeral, the family meeting with the lawyer was scheduled. My parents, Michael, my aunt and uncle, and I gathered in the sterile conference room. The lawyer, a serious man in his 50s named Mr. Harrison, explained that Grandma's will was straightforward and clear. He confirmed what Grandma had told me. The house on Maple Street was left specifically to me, with no conditions other than that I maintain it for at least 5 years before deciding what to do with it. Her savings and investments were to be divided equally among her 3 children. I felt a mix of emotions, gratitude for Grandma's generosity, sadness that she was gone, and a strange sense of validation. She had seen me, recognized my worth, and provided for me in a way my own parents never had. My parents' reaction was subtle but noticeable. A brief exchange of glances, a slight tightening of my mother's jaw. Michael looked disappointed, as if he had expected to inherit something substantial. My aunt and uncle seemed pleased with the arrangement, nodding in approval. The meeting concluded and we all left the lawyer's office. My parents suggested we go to dinner to celebrate Grandma's life and legacy, but I declined, still too deep in grief to pretend to celebrate anything. I wanted to be alone with my thoughts, to process what had happened and what the future might hold. As I drove home that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My parents had been unusually quiet about the inheritance, their reaction not matching what I would have expected. But I dismissed my concerns, attributing them to grief and stress. I had no idea that this was just the beginning of a betrayal that would shatter my family and change my life forever. 6 months passed after Grandma's death. The initial sharp pain of grief had dulled to a constant ache, a background noise in my life. I had thrown myself into work at the marketing firm where I'd been promoted to junior account executive, finding purpose in the busy pace of campaigns and client meetings. The house on Maple Street had remained empty since Grandma's passing. My parents had suggested we clean it out and prepare it for sale, but I had resisted. The thought of strangers living in Grandma's home, touching her things, sitting in her favorite chair, it was too much to bear. I told them I needed more time, that I wasn't ready to let go completely. In truth, I had been making plans of my own. The house was paid for, and with my steady income, I could afford the property taxes and maintenance. I had decided to move in once my current lease expired in 3 months. The idea of living in Grandma's house, surrounded by her memories and the things she had cherished, brought me comfort. It felt like a way to keep her close, to honor her legacy. Meanwhile, Michael had embarked on yet another business venture. This time it was a revolutionary meal prep delivery service that he claimed would disrupt the entire food industry. It was his 5th business attempt in as many years. The first, a trendy coffee shop, had lasted 8 months before folding due to poor management. The second, a high-end gym, had gone under after 6 months when he couldn't retain members. The third and fourth, a tech startup and a clothing line, had been even shorter-lived. Each time, our parents had bailed him out, either with direct financial support or by taking on second mortgages and loans. They never seemed to learn, always convinced that Michael's next idea would be the one that finally made him successful. They called it investing in their son's future. I called it enabling his irresponsibility. This new venture was no different. Michael had rented commercial kitchen space, hired staff, and invested in packaging and delivery vehicles. He was living beyond his means, leasing a luxury apartment downtown and driving a sports car he couldn't afford. Yet somehow he always managed to appear successful, at least on the surface. It was on a sunny Saturday in April that I decided to visit the house on Maple Street. I wanted to start planning the renovations I would make before moving in. Nothing major, just updating the kitchen and bathrooms, repainting, and maybe refinishing the hardwood floors. I had saved up enough to cover these improvements without taking on debt. As I turned onto Maple Street, I noticed something odd. There was a for sale sign in the yard of Grandma's house.
But it was different from the one I had expected. This one had a sold banner across it. My heart began to race as I parked in the driveway. The house looked different, too. The garden that Grandma had tended so lovingly was overgrown. The familiar blue curtains were gone from the windows, replaced by generic white blinds. Something was terribly wrong. I fumbled for the key Grandma had given me years ago, my hands shaking. It didn't work in the lock. The deadbolt had been changed. Panic set in as I peered through the window. The house was empty, completely stripped of all furniture, all the personal touches that had made it Grandma's home. I called my mother, my voice trembling as I asked what was happening. There was a pause on the other end. Then her voice, unusually calm, explaining that they had decided to sell the house for me. They claimed it was for the best, that the upkeep would be too much for me to handle alone, that I would thank them later. The conversation grew heated as I demanded answers. When had they sold it? Why hadn't they consulted me? Where was the money? My mother became evasive, eventually passing the phone to my father, who told me not to worry, that everything had been handled in the family's best interest. I hung up, sick to my stomach. Something didn't add up. If they had sold the house for me, why hadn't I seen any money? Why hadn't I been involved in the process? Where was the money? The next morning, I went to the county clerk's office, my heart heavy with dread. I requested the property records for Grandma's house. What I found made my blood run cold. The house had been sold 3 months ago, just 2 months after Grandma's death. The sale price was $425,000, a fair market value for the neighborhood. But the most shocking discovery was who had signed the documents. It wasn't just my parents. My name was on the paperwork too, forged with a skill that was frighteningly convincing. They had managed to sell the house without my knowledge or consent, using a fraudulent signature to complete the transaction. I left the clerk's office in a daze, the copies of the documents clutched in my hand. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I could barely process it. My own parents had stolen my inheritance, forging my signature to sell the house that Grandma had specifically left to me. The question that echoed in my mind as I drove home was, where was the money? And why would they do something so devastating to their own daughter? The confrontation with my parents happened 2 days later. I had spent the intervening time gathering evidence, consulting with a lawyer friend who had given me some initial advice, and steeling myself for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. I printed copies of the property records, the forged documents, and a copy of Grandma's will. I arrived at my childhood home on Sunday afternoon, knowing they would both be there. Michael's car was in the driveway too, which wasn't surprising. Despite being 26 years old, he still frequently came home to do laundry and get home-cooked meals. My mother opened the door, her smile faltering when she saw the serious expression on my face. I walked past her into the living room, where my father was watching golf and Michael was scrolling through his phone. The tension in the room was palpable as I placed the documents on the coffee table. I explained that I knew what they had done, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and hurt. I knew they had sold Grandma's house. The reactions were immediate and telling. My father turned off the television, his face paling. My mother sank on the couch, her hands trembling. Michael looked up from his phone, confused and annoyed at the interruption. My mother began to stammer an excuse, her voice wavering. She claimed they had done it for me, that the house was too much responsibility, a burden I couldn't handle. She insisted the taxes and maintenance would have been too much. I cut her off, pointing to the forged signature. I asked why my signature was on the documents, why they hadn't talked to me first, and where the money was. My father took over, his tone shifting from defensive to authoritative. He insisted they had my best interests at heart, claiming the money was being held in trust for me as a surprise for my birthday. It was a lie, and we all knew it. I could see it in their eyes, in the way they avoided looking directly at me. Michael, sensing that this had something to do with him, spoke up. He asked what the big deal was, that it was just a house, and that he had needed the money for his business. He claimed it was going to be huge and that he would pay me back tenfold. The casual entitlement in his voice made me see red. I responded that it wasn't just a house, it was Grandma's house, and that she had left it specifically to me. I pointed out his history of 4 failed businesses and questioned why this one would be any different. The argument escalated from there. Accusations flew, voices rose, and years of resentment bubbled to the surface. My parents defended their decision, claiming that as Michael's business was family business, using the inheritance was justified. They accused me of being selfish, of not understanding the importance of supporting family. Finally, cornered by the evidence and unable to maintain their lies, they broke. My mother dissolved into tears, admitting that they had indeed sold the house and given all the money to Michael for his business venture. My father, unable to meet my eyes, explained that they had believed this would finally be Michael's success story. My mother sobbed that the business was already struggling. He'd had to lay off half his staff. The commercial kitchen was too expensive, and the delivery costs were higher than expected. I listened in stunned silence as they detailed how Michael had already burned through most of the $425,000 in just 3 months. Luxury office furniture, top-of-the-line kitchen equipment, a fleet of delivery vehicles, expensive marketing campaigns, and of course, his inflated salary and lifestyle expenses. The full weight of the betrayal settled over me. Not only had my parents stolen my inheritance and given it to my irresponsible brother, but the money was almost entirely gone, squandered on yet another doomed business venture. I stated calmly that I wanted the money back, all of it. Michael laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. He said it was gone, invested in the business. He added that I couldn't get blood from a stone. My father intervened, his tone conciliatory. He said they would figure something out. Maybe Michael could pay me back in installments when the business took off. I stood up, gathering the documents from the coffee table. I told them they had stolen from me, that they had forged my signature and sold my inheritance. I said this wasn't a family disagreement, it was a crime. The threat of legal action hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My mother began to plead, talking about family unity and forgiveness. My father grew stern, warning me not to do something I would regret. But the damage was done. As I walked out of their house that day, I knew that our family would never be the same. The trust was broken beyond repair, the betrayal too complete to overlook. I had a decision to make: let them get away with it, or fight for what was rightfully mine. The following week, I met with a lawyer specializing in inheritance disputes. She reviewed the documents I had brought, listened to my story, and laid out my options. The case was clear-cut. My parents had committed fraud by forging my signature. Grandma's will was specific and legally binding. The lawyer warned me that pursuing legal action would likely destroy any remaining relationship with my family. She suggested mediation as a first step, but I knew that my parents would never agree to repay the money voluntarily. They had shown no remorse, only regret at being caught. I told her I wanted to proceed with a lawsuit. I explained that I didn't want to hurt them, but they needed to face the consequences of what they had done. As I left the lawyer's office that day, I felt a mixture of determination and dread. I was about to sue my own parents, to take legal action against the people who had raised me. It was a step I never thought I would take, but they had left me with no other choice. The legal papers were served the following week. My mother called me, crying and begging me to drop the lawsuit. My father didn't call at all, his silence speaking volumes. Michael sent me a series of angry text messages, calling me selfish and threatening to countersue for emotional distress. The battle lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back. My family was about to be torn apart in a very public way, all because my parents had chosen to enable my brother's irresponsibility at my expense. The lawsuit was filed in early June, and the repercussions were immediate and far-reaching. Word spread quickly through our extended family and small community. My aunt and uncle, Grandma's other children, were horrified when they learned what had happened. They had always suspected my parents favored Michael, but even they were shocked by the extent of the betrayal. My aunt called me as soon as she heard, her voice a mixture of anger and concern. She offered her full support, even agreeing to testify on my behalf if needed. She shared stories of how my parents had always treated Michael as the golden child, how they had made excuses for his failures while criticizing my achievements. It was validating to hear someone else acknowledge the family dynamics I had experienced my entire life. My uncle was equally supportive, though more reserved in his response. He offered to help with legal expenses, which I gratefully accepted. Even with the lawyer working on a contingency basis, there were court fees and other expenses that were adding up quickly. The discovery process was eye-opening. My lawyer requested financial records from my parents and Michael, revealing a pattern of irresponsible spending and poor financial decisions that went back years. The $425,000 from the house sale had been funneled directly into Michael's business account, then spent with astonishing speed. There were receipts for luxury office furniture, expensive restaurant equipment, a fleet of customized delivery vans, and a lavish launch party that had cost over $20,000. Michael had also leased a luxury apartment downtown, bought a high-end car, and taken several business trips to exotic locations. What was most disturbing was the discovery that my parents had also taken out a second mortgage on their own home to give Michael additional money for his business. They had drained their retirement accounts and maxed out credit cards, all to fund his latest venture. The depth of their financial commitment to enabling him was staggering. Meanwhile, Michael's business was failing faster than anyone had anticipated. The meal prep delivery service, which had started with such promise, was struggling to retain customers. Complaints about food quality, delivery times, and customer service had flooded online review sites. Employees hadn't been paid in weeks, and vendors were threatening legal action over unpaid invoices. By July, the business was on life support. Michael was desperately trying to pivot, changing the menu, reducing prices, and offering promotions, but it was too little, too late. The money was gone, the reputation was damaged, and customers were leaving in droves. The emotional toll of the lawsuit was immense. Family gatherings became awkward or non-existent. My parents and I communicated only through lawyers. Michael sent me occasional angry messages, blaming me for his business troubles. The stress affected my work, my sleep, and my relationships with friends. I moved into a smaller apartment to save money, selling my car and using public transportation. Every day was a struggle between maintaining my professional composure and dealing with the private turmoil of the lawsuit. Some nights, I would lie awake questioning my decision, wondering if I should have just let it go for the sake of family peace. But then I would remember Grandma, her strength and wisdom, and I would find my resolve again. She had left me that house for a reason, and honoring her memory meant fighting for what was rightfully mine. The mediation session in August was a disaster. My parents arrived with a lawyer of their own, presenting a sob story about how they had only been trying to help Michael succeed. They offered to repay a fraction of the money over 10 years with no interest, a laughable proposal that my lawyer rejected immediately. Michael was even more defiant, claiming that the business was still viable and would eventually turn a profit. He refused to take responsibility for the squandered inheritance, instead blaming market conditions, unfair competition, and my lawsuit for creating negative publicity. The mediator, a retired judge with years of experience in family disputes, tried valiantly to find common ground. But with my parents unwilling to acknowledge the wrongdoing and Michael refusing to accept any responsibility, the session ended without resolution. The case was headed to court. As we left the mediation center, my mother tried to approach me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She pleaded with me, saying that family shouldn't be fighting like this. I looked at her, at the woman who had raised me, who had once bandaged my scraped knees and kissed my bruises, but who had also betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible. I replied that she was right, family shouldn't be fighting like this. But I also said that families shouldn't steal from each other, shouldn't forge signatures, shouldn't lie and manipulate. I told her that they had made their choice, and now we all had to live with the consequences. The trial was scheduled for October, exactly 1 year after Grandma's death. The irony wasn't lost on me. The anniversary of her passing would now be marked by a courtroom battle over the inheritance she had carefully planned for me. As the days grew shorter and the leaves began to change color, I prepared for the trial. I spent hours with my lawyer, reviewing evidence, preparing testimony, and steeling myself for what would undoubtedly be the most difficult experience of my life. I was about to publicly expose my parents' betrayal, to detail their fraud in open court, to stand up to the family dynamics that had defined my entire existence. It was terrifying, but it was also necessary. For Grandma, for myself, and for the principle that actions have consequences, even for family. The courtroom was colder than I expected, both in temperature and atmosphere. As I sat beside my lawyer on that crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Grandma's funeral, I felt a strange mixture of dread and determination. The past year had been a roller coaster of emotions, but today there would finally be resolution. My parents arrived with their lawyer, avoiding eye contact with me as they took their seats across the aisle. Michael wasn't there. He had been served with a subpoena but had failed to appear, claiming business obligations. His absence spoke volumes about his character and his willingness to face the consequences of his actions. The judge, a stern woman in her 50s with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings, entered the courtroom and we all rose. After the preliminary formalities, my lawyer began presenting our case. She methodically laid out the evidence, the copy of Grandma's will clearly stating that the house was to be left to me, the property records showing the sale 3 months after Grandma's death, and the forged documents with my signature. A handwriting expert testified that the signature on the sale documents was indeed a forgery, with differences in pen pressure, letter formation, and flow that were inconsistent with my known signature. The expert pointed out specific characteristics that indicated someone had attempted to copy my signature rather than it being authentic. My aunt testified next, corroborating my account of Grandma's intentions and her specific conversations about leaving the house to me. She also described the family dynamics, how my parents had always favored Michael and enabled his irresponsible behavior. Her testimony was emotional but clear, providing context for the betrayal. The most damning testimony came from the real estate agent who had handled the sale. She stated that my parents had presented themselves as acting on my behalf, claiming that I was too grief-stricken to handle the sale personally. She described how they had produced the forged documents and how the sale had been rushed through with unusual speed. When it was my turn to testify, I felt surprisingly calm. I spoke clearly about my relationship with Grandma, her specific intentions regarding the house, and my discovery of the sale. I described the confrontation with my parents and their admission of what they had done. I didn't exaggerate or embellish, I simply stated the facts of what had happened. The cross-examination by my parents' lawyer was intense but ineffective. He tried to paint me as an ungrateful daughter who was overreacting to a well-intentioned mistake. He suggested that I had misunderstood my parents' intentions and that they had only been trying to help Michael succeed for the benefit of the entire family. But the evidence was too compelling, the facts too clear. No amount of spin could change the reality that my parents had deliberately deceived me, forged my signature, and sold my inheritance without my knowledge or consent. When my parents testified, their defense was weak and inconsistent. They maintained that they had only been trying to help Michael, that they had intended to repay the money once his business became successful. They claimed they had acted out of love for their son, not malice toward their daughter. But under cross-examination, their story fell apart. They couldn't explain why they had forged my signature rather than discussing the sale with me. They couldn't justify why they had given all the money to Michael despite his history of failed business ventures. They couldn't deny that they had deliberately deceived me and attempted to cover up their actions. The most revealing moment came when my father was asked why they hadn't consulted me before selling the house. After some hesitation, he admitted that they knew I would never agree to the sale, that I had always been overly attached to the house and to Grandma's memory. The implication was clear. They knew what they were doing was wrong, which is why they had hidden it from me. The trial lasted 3 days, with each day bringing new revelations and deeper insights into the family dynamics that had led to this moment. The judge listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions but otherwise remaining impassive. On the final day, after all testimony had been heard and closing arguments made, the judge retired to consider her verdict. The wait was agonizing, just 30 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. My parents sat huddled together with their lawyer, occasionally glancing my way with expressions that ranged from defiance to pleading. When the judge returned, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke clearly and decisively, finding in my favor on all counts. She ruled that the sale of the house had been fraudulent, that my signature had been forged, and that my parents had violated both the law and the terms of Grandma's will. The judgment was substantial. My parents were ordered to repay the full $425,000 from the sale of the house, plus interest and legal fees. The judge also imposed punitive damages, citing the deliberate nature of the fraud and the breach of fiduciary duty. There was one problem, however. As my lawyer quietly pointed out to me after the ruling, collecting the judgment would be another matter entirely. My parents had already depleted their savings and retirement accounts to fund Michael's business. Their house was heavily mortgaged, and their credit was ruined. They had the legal obligation to repay me, but not necessarily the financial means. Michael, who had been absent from the trial, was also named in the judgment. The judge ordered him to repay a portion of the money, recognizing that he had been the primary beneficiary of the fraud. But like my parents, his financial situation was dire. The business had officially filed for bankruptcy the week before the trial, leaving him with substantial debts and no assets. As we left the courtroom, my mother approached me, her face streaked with tears. She whispered that she was sorry, that they never meant to hurt me, that they just wanted to help Michael succeed. I looked at her, at the woman who had betrayed me so completely, and felt a surge of conflicting emotions. There was anger, yes, but also pity. She and my father had enabled Michael for so long that they couldn't see the damage they were doing, to him, to me, and to themselves. I replied softly that I knew they didn't mean to hurt me, but they had, and I said that actions have consequences. My father stood apart, his face a mask of resignation and regret. He didn't speak, but his eyes said what words couldn't. The judgment was final, the legal battle over, but the family was fractured beyond repair. As I walked away from the courthouse that day, victory felt hollow. I had won the case, but the money was likely gone forever. I had proven my point, but at the cost of my relationship with my parents. I had upheld Grandma's wishes, but the house she had left me was no longer in the family. The legal chapter of this story was closed, but the personal one was just beginning. Now came the difficult task of rebuilding my life, of finding a way forward without the inheritance that had been stolen from me, and without the family that had betrayed me. The weeks following the trial were a strange mixture of victory and disappointment. On one hand, the court had vindicated me, ruling unequivocally in my favor and affirming that what my parents had done was illegal and wrong. On the other hand, collecting on the judgment proved to be nearly impossible. My lawyer had been right to be cautious. My parents' financial situation was dire. After reviewing their assets and liabilities, it became clear that even if they liquidated everything they owned, they would still fall far short of the $425,000 they owed me, let alone the interest and legal fees. Their house, once a symbol of middle-class stability, was heavily mortgaged with little equity. Their retirement accounts had been drained to fund Michael's business. Their credit cards were maxed out, and they had taken out personal loans from various sources. The financial hole they had dug for themselves was deep and seemingly bottomless. Michael's situation was even worse. The bankruptcy proceedings revealed a staggering amount of debt, with creditors lining up to claim whatever assets might remain. His luxury apartment had been sublet, his car repossessed, and his business equipment auctioned off for pennies on the dollar. He had moved back in with my parents, bringing nothing with him but his sense of entitlement and his collection of excuses. The family dynamics had shifted dramatically. Where once Michael had been the golden child, he was now the source of their financial ruin. The tension in their household must have been palpable, though I had no direct contact with them. All communication went through lawyers, a formal and impersonal process that highlighted the chasm that had opened between us. My aunt and uncle tried to mediate, suggesting family counseling and a repayment plan that might allow my parents to gradually pay back what they owed. But I knew that any such plan would be unrealistic given their financial situation and their history of poor decision-making. The likelihood of them actually following through on a long-term repayment plan was slim to none. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my own life. I had moved into a smaller, more affordable apartment, cut back on expenses, and taken on some freelance marketing projects to supplement my income. The financial strain was real, but there was also a sense of freedom in knowing that I was relying only on myself, not on an inheritance that might never materialize. Work became my refuge. I throw myself into my job, taking on challenging projects and proving my value to the company. Within 6 months of the trial, I was promoted to account executive with a substantial raise that eased some of my financial concerns. The recognition felt good. This was something I had earned on my own merits, not something given to me out of guilt or obligation. The emotional healing was slower. The betrayal by my own parents left scars that ran deep. I struggled with trust issues, questioning people's motives and second-guessing their intentions. Friendships became more complicated as I navigated the delicate balance between protecting myself and remaining open to genuine connections. Therapy helped. A counselor recommended by my EAP program at work provided a safe space to process the complex emotions surrounding the betrayal. She helped me understand that my parents' actions, while hurtful, were more about their own issues and dysfunctional family dynamics than about me personally. She explained during one session that they had created a narrative where Michael was the investment and I was the afterthought. When Grandma disrupted that narrative by leaving me the house, they couldn't adjust their worldview. Instead, they tried to restore the balance by taking what was mine and giving it to him. This perspective helped, but it didn't erase the pain. There were still moments of intense anger, waves of grief, and periods of profound loneliness. Holidays were particularly difficult, reminders of the family gatherings that would never be the same. The first Christmas after the trial was especially hard. I spent the day alone, refusing invitations from friends who didn't understand my need for solitude. I thought about Grandma, about the holidays we had spent in her house on Maple Street, and I allowed myself to grieve, not just for her, but for the family I had lost. My aunt called that evening, her voice gentle and understanding. She told me that my parents and Michael were having a small, quiet Christmas, that the mood was somber, and that my absence was felt. She didn't try to convince me to reconcile or to forgive, simply offering a connection that didn't demand anything from me. She said softly that my mother cries about me sometimes, not because she thinks she was right, but because she misses her daughter. I listened, my heart aching with a complicated mix of emotions. I admitted that I missed her too, but that I couldn't forget what she had done. I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. My aunt understood, and no one was asking me to. The call ended with an invitation to New Year's dinner at her house, an offer I accepted with some hesitation. It would be the first family gathering I would attend since the trial, and the thought filled me with both anxiety and a glimmer of hope. The new year brought unexpected developments. Michael, having hit rock bottom, finally showed signs of change. He had taken a job at a local restaurant, working as a line cook, a humble position for someone who had once seen himself as a business tycoon. According to my aunt, he was working hard, showing up on time, and even taking on extra shifts. My parents, too, seemed to be slowly adjusting to their new reality. They had met with a financial counselor and were making small but consistent payments toward their debts. The strain was evident in their appearances. My mother had lost weight, my father's hair had turned grayer, but there was also a certain resignation, an acceptance of the consequences of their actions. In March, 6 months after the trial, I received a certified letter from my parents' lawyer. It contained a check for $5,000 and a letter from my mother. She wrote that she knew this was just a drop in the bucket of what they owed me, but they wanted to show me that they were trying. She explained that they had both taken part-time jobs and were committed to repaying me, even if it took the rest of their lives. She wrote that they didn't expect forgiveness, but hoped that someday I might be able to find peace. I deposited the check, the first payment toward the debt they owed me. It was a small amount, barely making a dent in the total judgment, but it was something. A tangible acknowledgement of their wrongdoing and a first step toward making amends. In March, 6 months after the trial, I received a certified letter from my parents' lawyer. It contained a check for $5,000 and a letter from my mother. She wrote that she knew this was just a drop in the bucket of what they owed me, but they wanted to show me that they were trying. She explained that they had both taken part-time jobs and were committed to repaying me, even if it took the rest of their lives. She wrote that they didn't expect forgiveness, but hoped that someday I might be able to find peace. I deposited the check, the first payment toward the debt they owed me. It was a small amount, barely making a dent in the total judgment, but it was something. A tangible acknowledgement of their wrongdoing and a first step toward making amends. In March, 6 months after the trial, I received a certified letter from my parents' lawyer. It contained a check for $5,000 and a letter from my mother. She wrote that she knew this was just a drop in the bucket of what they owed me, but they wanted to show me that they were trying. She explained that they had both taken part-time jobs and were committed to repaying me, even if it took the rest of their lives. She wrote that they didn't expect forgiveness, but hoped that someday I might be able to find peace. I deposited the check, the first payment toward the debt they owed me. It was a small amount, barely making a dent in the total judgment, but it was something. A tangible acknowledgement of their wrongdoing and a first step toward making amends. That same month, I received another unexpected development. The new owners of Grandma's house, a young couple with 2 small children, had found a box of Grandma's belongings in the attic that had been overlooked during the sale. They had seen the news coverage of the trial and tracked me down through my lawyer. The box contained old photographs, letters, and journals, treasures I had thought lost forever. As I sat on my living room floor, carefully examining each item, I felt Grandma's presence strongly. There, among the memorabilia, was a letter she had written to me but never given, to be opened in case of emergency. The letter read, in part, "My dear Courtney, if you're reading this, it means something has gone wrong. Remember that your worth is not determined by how others treat you, but by how you treat yourself. Stand up for what is right, even when it's hard. Forgive when you can, but never forget your own value. I love you more than words can say." Tears streamed down my face as I held the letter, Grandma's words providing comfort and guidance even after her death. She had known me so well, understood my struggles, and anticipated the challenges I might face. The box of memories also contained something unexpected, a small key with a tag that read, "Safety Deposit Box number 742. At the bottom of the tag was an address for a bank downtown. Curious, I made an appointment to visit the bank the following week, wondering what other surprises Grandma might have left for me. The bank visit revealed Grandma's final gift to me. Inside the safety deposit box was another letter, along with a portfolio of stocks and bonds worth approximately $150,000. The letter explained that she had set aside this money as a backup plan, worried that my parents might try to interfere with my inheritance. She had written that she knew my parents, how they favored Michael and enabled his irresponsibility. The house was my primary inheritance, but she wanted to ensure I had something that they couldn't touch. This money was mine, free and clear, to do with as I saw fit. She urged me to use it wisely, to invest in myself, in my future, in the dreams she knew I had. The discovery was overwhelming, a mix of emotions that left me both grateful and sad. Grateful for Grandma's foresight and her unwavering support, but sad that she had felt the need to create this backup plan, that she had anticipated the very betrayal that had occurred. The money couldn't replace the house or the years of family dysfunction, but it provided a foundation for rebuilding my life. After consulting with a financial advisor, I decided to use a portion of the money to buy a small condo, putting down a substantial down payment that would keep my monthly payments manageable. The rest I invested, following the advisor's recommendations for a diversified portfolio that would grow over time. Moving into my own place, a space that was truly mine, felt like a new beginning. It wasn't Grandma's house, but it was a home, a place where I could heal and rebuild. I carefully arranged the photographs and memorabilia from the box, creating a small shrine to the woman who had believed in me when no one else had. The relationship with my family continued to evolve. My parents made regular payments, though small, toward the debt they owed me. We communicated occasionally through my aunt, who served as an intermediary. There were no apologies that could undo what had happened, no words that could repair the deep breach of trust, but there was a gradual acceptance of our new reality. Michael showed the most significant change. He continued working at the restaurant, eventually becoming a sous chef. He had given up on get-rich-quick schemes, focusing instead on developing his culinary skills. According to my aunt, he was a different person, humbled by his failures, more thoughtful in his decisions, and increasingly aware of the impact his actions had on others. In a surprising turn of events, Michael reached out to me directly on my 30th birthday. The text message was simple. "Happy birthday, Courtney. I know I don't deserve it, but I hope you have a good day. I'm sorry for everything." I didn't respond immediately, wrestling with conflicting emotions. The message felt sincere, a stark contrast to the arrogant and entitled person he had been for so long. That evening, after a quiet dinner with friends, I finally replied with a simple, "Thank you. I appreciate you saying that." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement.
A small step on a long road. Life didn't magically become perfect. The scars from the betrayal remained, a reminder of the painful lesson I had learned about family and loyalty. There were still holidays that felt a little empty, still moments of anger and sadness when I thought about what could have been. But there was also peace, a sense of closure that came not from my parents' repayment or my brother's apology, but from within myself. I had stood up for what was right. I had honored Grandma's memory by fighting for the legacy she intended for me. And most importantly, I had built a life for myself on my own terms. The inheritance Grandma had left me wasn't just a house or a sum of money. It was the belief she had in me, the strength she saw in me, and the wisdom she had shared. That was the true legacy, the one that could never be sold or forged or stolen. And as I sat in my own living room, surrounded by the remnants of her love, I finally felt like I was home.